I have about 25 minutes, and these are the topics that I'm going to talk about after my friends here stop chatting. So I'm here, basically, I met Jack in Angoulême, which is in France. When I was working at Disney, I went to this wonderful conference in this amazing town where Jack used to live, and presented some of the new work that Disney was working on. And also, part of my responsibilities at the time were to scout companies that Disney could work with in France and other places. As you probably know, Disney had an amazing animation studio in Paris. They did much of Tarzan, which is one of my favorite Disney movies of that period. And so there was a lot of activity, and I think there still is a lot of activity behind the scenes between Disney and France. And one of the projects that I enjoyed the most was Mickey's Twice Upon a Christmas, which is not a major movie. It was a direct-to-video production that, surprisingly, Disney decided to do out of house. So Disney, and I was one of the ones scouting the world, looking for companies that could do believable Disney-quality Mickey Mouse and Friends within a pretty tight budget. And Sparks, which is a company based in Paris at the time, they have closed since, and one of the partners has a new company called Timto. They got half of the movie. The other half of the movie was done by Blur. This was in 2004. And this was really pretty significant because it was the first time that we saw Mickey Mouse in a feature as a CG Mickey Mouse. If we have time, I can show you the Timto reel. It's very interesting, but I'd rather just talk a bit more. I was also involved with Disney Pictures in talking to these different French companies that do visual effects. And as you probably know, some of the most incredible visual effects have been made by French companies, and some of these are here, which the previous speakers have mentioned them too. La Maison is one of my favorite boutique companies in Paris. They do some of the most beautiful work done today in terms of visual effects. And two movies that I recommend you watch if you're interested in French-made for French movies visual effects are Blueberry, which was mentioned here. Blueberry is after a Moebius strip, but it was also a movie directed, I believe, by a French director, and made by, I think, Magoff did the effects. And The Brotherhood of the Wolves is another live-action French feature that I highly recommend. We don't really have a lot of time to talk about all this stuff, but anyway. So I was asked to talk about the French touch, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about history. And yes, I love a lot of French things. I love good wine, I love good food, I love good perfume, good clothes. There's a lot of good things in France. And a lot of the French touch, the French attitude, if you will, has to do with their history. That's at least my point of view. We're just going to talk for 2 minutes about some of their history. If you zoom back to the end of the 18th century, they had one of the most powerful and successful monarchies in Europe. You know, they were pretty much the center of the world. And then in 1789, the French Revolution happened. One of the first, or the first massive popular revolution in Europe that really ended a monarchy. I mean, this must have been really massive. It's hard for us to imagine how this happened, but just imagine it. And of course, this is beautiful Delacroix painting about liberty leading the people. So 4 years after the revolution erupted in 1789, the king was guillotined. Now imagine one of the most powerful people on earth, the king of France, being guillotined by his own people. That must have been so shocking. And of course, in my opinion, I think that left an impression in the people's psyche. You can go from here to here, and it's only 4 years. Then a civil war, which was called the Reign of Terror, which was a really conflicting, really complicated civil war, erupted out of nowhere. And 10 years later, a very powerful, smart military man, he said, I've had enough of this nonsense, I'm going to impose the rule of the law again. And 5 years later, he was crowned Emperor of France. So in the period of 15 years, you go from the most powerful absolute monarchy in Europe to first revolution, civil war, coup d'etat, emperor. Wow. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty rich history. So as I said, I think that complex psyche and the desire to express it is very French. I think French are very aware of their history, as they should. It's a wonderful history, and they like to talk about it, and they make it their own. Now, French also have a proven capacity to make rules. The monarchy is all about rules. High cooking, haute cuisine, high fashion is all about rules, the rules that you have to follow. But they also have a proven capacity to break those rules, which is really, I know it sounds funny, but it's very essential to the French spirit, and in a way, to the Latin spirit. And that is something that we can learn a lot from. I think the French touch is a bit of being cynical about life. Of course, if you have an absolute monarch and 2 years later he's dead and 15 years later you have another emperor, that definitely brews existentialism, which was, of course, started, I mean, it grew, it was born in France. All right, let's talk a little bit about painting. This is another thing that really feeds into today's French animation in a very deep way. The first interdisciplinary art school was actually created in Paris when the conservatory, three different institutions, the conservatory, the painting school, and the architecture school merged into the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was kind of an interdisciplinary, one-stop shop of all things that had to do with art. And of course, they saw their job as recreating the Greek and Roman culture, very neoclassic, idealized nature in exquisite detail, and some of the previous speakers talked about that exquisite detail, that attention to detail. That is very French because that is really one of the principles of the Academy. And of course, Ingres is the quintessential representative of that. And it's interesting because, as you probably know, or if you don't know, I'll tell you, most of the renderers that we use today, that you use, have been written by French programmers. And rendering is all about that. Rendering is really about breaking down the impact of light on a surface and expressing how it shades it. Wow. 74 years after the French Revolution, this guy called Claude Monet decided to paint a nude woman having lunch on a park in those years. A contemporary woman naked having lunch scandalized the academics. And it was rejected from their annual or biannual show called the Salon. So the king at the time, constitutional king, decided to create a special salon for those who were rejected so they could show their images. And of course, just to make the long story short, Impressionism was born out of this. Impressionism is another very fundamental part of the cultural psyche of France because they were about doing things in a radically different way. Yet, today, Impressionism is one of the most mainstream painting styles. So they were about going outside and painting in the open air. What a concept. Before that, painters used to paint inside in the studio. But they said, no, let's take your canvas outside. Let's use different types of brush strokes. Let's get inspired from photography, which was a new art at the time, to create new types of compositions that basically look like handheld cameras that nobody had done before. So Impressionism is a deeply innovative and based on new technologies type of movement. And again, it's not a coincidence that some of the early and some of the best non-photorealistic renderers that are out there have been written by French, because they're very familiar with this. It's not just some painting in a museum, it's part of you, it's part of your culture, part of your life. Of course, French art in general benefited in the early 20th century from being a cultural center, a true cultural center where people from all over the world wanted to go there, such as Chagall and Picasso, and create and innovate new things. New radical movements like surrealism, we don't really have time to talk about it in detail, were born there. And you see all this deep past in the shorts of Gobelin or in the work of French people. I didn't know this, but I read the other day that Paris has the highest density of movie theaters by resident. And this is interesting because that means that people go to the movies a lot. And you know, the French movie market is a very small market because there's not a lot of French-speaking people around the world. But people do go a lot to the movies in Paris, and that's wonderful. And I'm skipping a few things because I want to finish on time here. All right, let's talk about the early days of cinema and photography. The first permanent photograph created by a Frenchman, 1826. The first photo of people, and also a whole technique called daguerreotype was created by a Frenchman. We're talking here middle of the 19th century. The birth of cinematography, the Lumiere brothers, 1895. Some pretty significant stuff happened in France that is still in the subconscious culture of French people, I believe, and the attitude, the cultural attitude, and the innovation of art and technology. The birth of visual effects with this wonderful 14-minute short film, A Trip to the Moon, by Georges Méliès. The first animated cartoon by Émile Cohl in 1908. Wow, this is pretty impressive. But of these 5 massive events, the one that impresses me the most is that in 1839, the same year that Daguerre announced his technique of daguerreotype, the first viable photographic technique, the French government bought the patent and put it in the public domain. And you go, wow, this is really a very interesting move. Why would they do that? Because they want the world to have it. They want the people to have it. And you think, wow, this is kind of special. Would that happen today? I don't know. Another thing that I think is very powerful in terms of feeding French creativity today is a French new wave of cinema that really took place in the late 50s and early 60s by directors such as Truffaut, Godard, Alain Resnais, etc. And the French new wave, as I said before, the French are very good at breaking the rules. Well, this is the best example of French people breaking the rules. Their main goal was to reject the classic narrative form. They didn't like the classic narrative form of French movie makers, and they didn't like the narrative form of Hollywood filmmakers. They wanted to tell stories in a different way, in a way that's not the classical storytelling technique. And I found it very interesting when Eric said that sometimes the Achilles tendon of French animation is storytelling. And I think maybe it has to do a little bit with this, because you know the new wave cinema movement was a very powerful and influential movement all over the world, and of course in France it's still very much alive, I think. And one of the things that they love to do in new wave cinema is to have open endings. You don't really know what happened in the end, or you don't really know what the filmmaker was trying to tell you. Well, you don't know, because he didn't or she didn't want you to know. That's part of the design. So, you know, they wanted to experiment with narrative ambiguity, etc. And most importantly, they developed this whole theory called the auteur theory, which is about film, and the filmic arts have to reflect the director's personal vision. Even if it's not a popular vision, even if it doesn't sell tickets, the goal of the cinematic arts is to express the director's personal vision. And that's still very much alive in French animation, for better and for worse. So here are some frames of these masterpieces that I highly recommend you see. And they're available, you can buy them, you can rent them. Okay, so finally, let's talk a little bit about animation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about French animation. So, I want to talk about just a couple of films that I think are very interesting and representative of the good and the not so good of French animation. Of course, as I mentioned before, they all reflect the director's personal vision. They all have a very tight relationship with the art process, which means that in these films, it's not the director who doesn't really get involved with the art. In many cases, the film is born out of the artwork, as you will see in the, well, as I will illustrate in a few seconds. Another thing that I'm going to talk about as I show you some of these images is the very unique process that today is active in the European production and funding system, which is quite different from the funding and production system in the US, for example. And another characteristic that I would say of some French films is that they start with very limited commercial expectations. The goal is not to make money. And I know this is shocking, especially in our society today. The goal is to express the director's personal vision. That is a massive, fundamental attitude that we can learn a lot from here in Singapore. All right, so let's talk about one of the first films that I chose here. La Planète Sauvage, in English it's called the what? I forgot. Yeah, the Savage Planet, the Wild Planet, yeah. This film won the jury prize in Cannes, 1973. Directed by René Laloux, and based on the artwork of Roland Topors. Okay? So here we have a wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, you really should. I mean, I might have a little time to show you a clip or so, but you should really watch it. It's a small little masterpiece that basically came out of the surreal fantasies of this excellent artist, illustrator called Roland Topor. And René Laloux made a movie around it. It was not a huge commercial success. This was the 70s, not a great decade for the animation market. Distribution for many movies was very limited, but it's a classic, and you should all check it out. And it really expresses that wonderful dynamic between artist, director, that's very, very alive, very much alive in French animation. Actually, I watched this movie when I was in my 20s, and for me it was like, whoa, this is really incredible. It's really amazing. Another film, which is one of my favorite films made in France, French animation favorite films, is Fears of the Dark. Fears of the Dark, I think, is 2007. And Fears of the Dark is a little bit of an experiment. It's really a compilation of 6 short films directed by 6 totally different people, some of whom are not directors. Actually, most of these individuals are illustrators. They've never directed a movie before, they know nothing about animation, but they worked with a team that facilitated their production of the movie. And I want to focus a little more on one of the pieces here, the one that was, I guess, designed and directed by Charles Burns, who's a very established American illustrator. This episode, how many people have seen the movie? I'm just curious. A few, 2, 4, 5 people. You should really watch this movie. It's fascinating. It's very creative, very artistic. Some of it is very sweet, some of it is very weird. It's really a wonderful movie. And this in particular starts as a young man remembering his early years and the things that he collected as a boy and his mother. And then he gets a girlfriend, and then it turns out that the girlfriend surprises him with something I'm not going to tell you because that'll ruin the movie. It's a science fiction film. And the reason why I think it's so important is because Charles Burns spent 30 years drawing with pen and ink on paper. Yet, his film is CG. So his animation is CG, full CG, animated with Maya actually, that was rendered with a special renderer that was developed to render things that look like Charles Burns artwork. And I actually talk about this in my book, the one that Jack mentioned before. The creativity and the technical savvy to develop a renderer that renders like the style of a very established and very recognized illustrator, to me, is really admirable. They did an amazing job. And the movie is also quite wonderful. movie Renaissance, which depicts Paris in 2054. This is a movie directed by Christian Volkmann. It came out in 2006. And this is an interesting movie that could have been an awesome classic, but unfortunately it wasn't. So this is not a successful movie on some levels, which I'll talk about, but I think it's very interesting. Now, what is the interesting thing about it? 2006, this movie was shot, or was created actually, with full motion capture. Motion capture, way before motion capture was actually working. In those years, motion capture was still a nightmare. And yet, these very entrepreneurial people decided to make a movie out of it. They got it done. They spent 20 million euros making it, which for a French movie at the time was a ridiculously large amount of money. Unfortunately, the results are mixed, but I highly recommend that you watch this movie. Visually, wow, it's a work of art. It's very much inspired by the Moebius aesthetic, but in black and white. The story doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes sense for 5 minutes, and then it doesn't make sense, and then you think it makes sense, and then you're lost again. Yeah, terrible story. And terrible storytelling, also. The storytelling is pretty bad.
That Achilles heel.
Yes, that Achilles heel.